I will argue in this presentation that many are afraid of what is called this woke generation and what reality has been captured in the difference between this 1776 project and the 1619 project, or what I choose to think of between Our Gang and Sesame Street, for those of you who are a little bit older. But let us begin. And let me start with this. Race, gender, and class have been seen through different lenses throughout modern times. So the debate about CRT is nothing new. The story starts with observations that Marx documented, the barbarism associated with the system of enslavement and treachery and bribery. But that's ahead of the gate here. Let me give you a definition of what CRT is. Critical race theory is started, by the way, in critical legal studies, where people like Crenshaw and Derek Bell were arguing that the way that laws have come into being reflect both class and race. Scholars after that began to start noticing that not only within legal structures, but within political institutions, within business institutions, within educational outcomes, that we notice this thing called race. It's part and parcel to a lot of what we do. But what is this thing called race? And why is it so important to this conversation? For this, let me give you some history. I'm going to deviate from my planned course here for a bit, but let's give some history. In the colony of Virginia in the 1600s, there was a planter elite, and they had both Irish labor and African labor that worked the fields and shipping and so forth and so on. And these two labor groups began to do some strange things, like partying together, drinking together, intermarrying together, and yes, planning insurrections together. In fact, they shut down Virginia and all of its commerce in a strike for better conditions and labor conditions and salaries and so forth and so on. And in the midst of this so-called rebellion, the colony was attacked by Native Americans. And so the planter elite found itself, on the one hand, being shut down by its labor, and on the other hand, being attacked by Native Americans. What did it do? It did something very strange. It created this thing called race. You see, race did not exist before that period of time. We had the human race, we had the English race, we had the French race, we had the Italian race, but we did not have something called the white race. What did they do? They convinced the Irish that they were white. And in the process, they elevated the group of newly formed whites slightly higher than the African servants, the African slaves. So what happens now? Now they are sheriffs, and they can beat and they can corral and so forth and so on this person that's slightly below them. There's an interesting book that you might want to see. It's called How the Irish Became White. Another one's How the Italians Became White. And there's yet another one, How the Jews Became White, okay? And interesting comments made by some individuals that Europeans leave Europe as all of these groups, and then they get to America and they suddenly become white. So I bring this up mainly because it is important that it's in the midst of this existential crisis that race came into being. And we'll see that throughout time, in this country, when there are existential crises, we've come back to this thing called race. So what is it? Currently, there's much confusion on the part of the right and the left in terms of in America and Europe about what critical race theory. Okay, and they've raised many questions. But let me back up again. We have been studying race in this country. I'm a product of the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago came into being, and guess what? It became at the same time that we began studying race and ethnicity in this country at the turn of the century. We have been studying ethnic groups and European ethnic groups that are transitioning into the United States for over 100 years. That's how the University of Chicago made its way, called ethnographic studies. W.B. Du Bois, over 100 years ago, was part of that group of scholars, and he made a interesting observation again over 100 years ago, where he stated that the problem of the 20th century is going to be a problem of race, of those who those who live on one side of this racial divide versus the other side of the racial divide. I find it interesting, and you see the photo of Martin Luther King, and he made the following observation while he's sitting in a jail. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion, he says, that the Negro's great stumbling block in their stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with the methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can get to the timetable for another man's freedom. I find it interesting that this current moment that we're in, we've just watched Congress, and a couple of Democrats says that we agree with what you want to do. We just don't agree with the methods that you want to accomplish that by. So what is this current existential moment, and why are we in this struggle right now? The existential moment, I would argue, started when one individual said, let us, current one, make America great again. All right, what is this conversation about? And who is he targeting in this conversation? By the way, those of you who are in Ohio have seen some recent ads where some individuals running for office, and there's only one group that are running ads right now, running for office, and they are targeting brown people. They're targeting Democrats, but they are also targeting this exit. Why now? This thing called race. Well, there's something happening in America right now, and it's been happening, by the way, for the last, about 10 years, where America is becoming more and more diverse. If you look at the news, you find out that within the next 10, 15 years, we're going to be more diverse then than we are now. The current generation, the so-called Generation Z, is the most diverse and the most populous group that we've ever produced in this country. And by the way, they are the smartest population in this country, okay? And by the way, they're also extremely politically active. So what does this mean? And why is this a history? Why are we concerned about this right now? In a recent article, an individual noticed that if they mark an animal, that animal, tag that animal, that animal would be systematically and consistently killed by predators. Predators often did not distinguish the individual animals in the herd, but responded to this marking. It's strange that the very reason that race and ethnic markers came into being, human groups, was to target certain individuals and groups, to further victimize them, to further separate them, to further distinguish them from other individuals. But what is this thing called race? Again, we look at some current statistics, we find that the largest group of hate crimes, this is 2020, you can do the same thing for 2021, 61% of hate crimes in this country are targeting race and ethnic groups. This, and by the way, this has been on the increase for the last 4-5 years, since we started this Make America Great Again. Okay, and the rise of so-called domestic terrorist groups that not only have targeted, by the way, race and ethnic groups, but also sexual orientation. We also of religious groups, particularly Jews, but also Islamic individuals. We just last week we found groups that were targeted. You have before you two women who just coincidentally happen to be twins. Yeah, twins. Born of the same mother, same father, same time, in the same womb, sharing the same egg and sperm. Yep, twins. What's interesting is, by the way, you could do a search on Google anytime you want to on biracial twins, and you see that these two are not alone. There are hundreds of such biracial twins that have been identified, literally hundreds. This group, what's interesting is that one, whose name is Mary and the other is Lucy, self-identify. One is Black and the other is white. They self-identify, and their friends, by the way, coincide with that same designation. In fact, Lucy has to regularly pull out her ID to prove that she is indeed the sister. She's not adopted, okay, and that they are indeed twins, born of the same mother and father, same egg, same time, so forth and so on. What does this mean? It means that race is not biology, it is social. Most of us are what I would call mutts. What does that mean? That means that all of us are biracial, all of us have multiple ancestries that have blended, and we are the most blended biological group of people in the world. Okay, and if you do a DNA analysis, you will find that we have these blends. So what does that mean? This means that when we talk about race, we're not talking about biology, but we're talking about social definitions and constructions. Well, so what? We got these other social constructions such as gender and sexuality and class, okay, and ability. All right. Many times we want to talk about these things separately, but guess what? We are simultaneously in a particular racial or ethnic group, we're simultaneously a particular sexual group, we're simultaneously a particular gender group, and we're simultaneously a particular class group and ability group and age group. And by the way, the list goes on. We live intersectionally. That's what that means. All right, and when we concentrate just on one of these, such as race or gender or sexuality, we ignore the complex realities of our existence. Okay, that we are indeed multi-identified, so forth and so on. By the way, what happens when we don't use these intersectional identities? We tend to ignore, for example, Black women who are trans. Okay, we assume that trans are one group, that women are one group, and that Black are a different group. But what about those individuals that cross multiple groups? Okay, what happens is that we slice and dice those identities, and in the process, we ignore the very complexity of what we are. And by the way, that has some very real consequences for how we write the laws. I'll give you one case in point, then I'll move on. Take affirmative action, for example. Affirmative action that was race-based tended to ignore these intersectional differences. And oh, by the way, who tended to benefit from affirmative action: affluent individuals in these racialized groups or poor individuals in these groups. I would argue, and research documents, that if you have a hiring policy that's affirmative action that requires a college degree, guess what? Individuals that don't have a college degree are less likely to be able to apply for that. Oh, lastly, who has been the #1 beneficiary of affirmative action in this country? White middle-class women. Yet most of the conversations about them has to do with people of color. Let's talk about this thing called discrimination. Everybody is biased. Let me repeat that. Everybody is biased. Okay, I tell my students, tell you what, you got a choice of me standing on the street corner and your mama standing on the street corner. Yeah, I said mama. Okay, because that's who I am. Okay, you know, I don't have a mother, I have a mama. But anyway, all right. And you got a Mack truck getting ready to hit one of us. I ask my students, you got your mama and you got me. Which one you gonna save? I ask you, Judge, which one do you say?
My mama, of course.
Hello, that's what I'm talking about. By the way, you just demonstrated your bias along with all of my students. Okay, the fact that you will choose your mama, by the way, if you said anything else, I will report you to your mama. Okay, real quickly here. Okay, that demonstrates that very clearly that we're biased. Bias is not the issue. Being ignorant of those biases is the issue. All right. And it's when we're in our institutional roles, when we're in our institutional formal roles as lawyers, as doctors, as professors, all right, and we're ignorant of those biases, and those biases influence our choices, our decisions, all right, then we discriminate. You see, discrimination is bias plus power. All right. That's why much of the D&I work that's taking place right now is aiming at persuasion, trying to persuade people not to be biased. All right. Does not work. Why? All right. We're all biased. That's not the issue. The issue is what we do with that bias within institutional structures. Okay. And unless we change the institutions and the rules affecting those, then we're not going to change these others. That's why much of what we're doing is wasted. We also hear these terms called white privilege. Okay. Guess what? We all got privilege. I come out of the ghetto. I got privilege. I can go places in East St. Louis that y'all can't go to. I'm sorry, I'm a college professor. I can go places in East St. Louis that you cannot go to. Okay. Y'all, all right. Okay. There are two kinds of bias. All right. You've got earned and unearned. Okay. I'm a college professor. I mean, privilege. I'm a college professor. I can do things as a college professor, Judge, that you can't do. Okay. You can do things as a judge that I cannot do, particularly in your capacity as a judge or me as a professor. Okay. So that means that we all have privileges that we have earned. There's also privileges that are unearned by virtue of being born. Okay. Both I got born. I had two parents that were married to each other that both worked. Okay. That gave me some privileges that many of my colleagues in East St. Louis did not have. All right. All right. To blame me because my parents both worked, all right, were able to afford me some resources that my colleague who only had one parent on welfare could not. All right. And then to make me feel guilty behind that. No, that's not the issue. Okay. The issue is not my privilege, but what one does with that privilege. All right. That privilege can be a barrier or it can be a bridge. Okay. And I can use my privilege as a professor at Miami University to open up opportunities to individuals that don't have those opportunities, or I can use my privileges to discriminate against others. So this notion of white privilege or even white guilt or white fragility are all bogus terms. Anybody that talks about, and by the way, they're doing it in D&I, talk about white guilt, white privilege, and white fragility, that all whites have privilege, all whites are guilty, and all whites are fragile. All right, they're making racist comments. By the way, there's a whole bunch of whites that do not have privilege, like Appalachians and poor whites. Okay. All right. They've suffered tremendously as a consequence of being poor and white. Hillbilly elegy is a classic example of that, or our white Appalachians, so forth and so on. In fact, here at Miami University next semester, this semester, we're going to be doing a class on reparations, and we got three groups that we've identified. Yes, Blacks. Yes, Native Americans. Yes, what? Oh, yes, poor whites. Appalachians have suffered as a consequence of racial discrimination in this country. All right. And they should also benefit from reparations. Okay. Notion that all are guilty ignores the history. There were Quakers, for example, that fought on the side of Native American, of Blacks and Native Americans. Okay. Benjamin Franklin argued against slavery. Okay. There were Blacks who, by the way, also who owned slaves during the same period of time, who served on the side of the Confederates. Hell, there were a group. Some of my people, Native Americans, were Choctaw. All right. My great grandmother was a Choctaw. Okay, she was a slave of Native Americans. Okay. All right. And it's in my blood, a Choctaw. Now, let me see. So should I be? Oh, that side of me was a slave owner, and I should have guilt as a consequence of that, but then I'm victimized on my other side. Just that's how ridiculous these conversations get. What this suggests is that racism is both institutionally based and systemic racism is what we're talking about. What do you mean by this? I want you to think about something about systemic processes and why just changing behavior does not work. And what does progress look like? There was a president named Truman a few years back, over 70 years ago, concerned about integrating the military. Notice, he did not say, guess what? Let's have a conversation about diversity. He didn't say, maybe we should have some sensitivity sessions. No, as the president and chief executive officer, he said, executive order number, whatever, that the military will integrate. And within that order, it came about. And because of that, the US military is the most integrated institution within the United States, and able to take this picture here of West Point graduates just last year, where 29 Black women graduated from West Point in that year. We never would have had a Colin Powell, by the way, to rise up to the highest rank in the military if it wasn't for this. What that raises the issue that unless we attack racism systemically or institutionally, by the way, the same thing as sexism, same thing as homophobia and so forth and so on, changing people's behavior does not change institutional practices. What are you talking about here? Take a look at the cradle to prison pipeline. There are those that want to fix the police. We have some more police boards. We get them to stop shooting Black folks, which we should, and Native Americans, which we should. That's not the issue. But that does not deal with the fact that some of our most violent communities are in some of our urban areas. By the way, how do we fix some of these problems institutionally? Research just took place. All right. Where do we have the highest gun violence in this country? In those states that have the least and most lenient gun laws, we have the most highest levels of gun violence. Those states, by the way, where we have the highest restrictions on gun ownership, we have the least amount of gun violence. By the way, the state of Mississippi has the highest level of gun violence. Okay, it also has the lowest levels of gun laws and control. California has the highest number of gun laws and has the least number of those that get killed. But what happens, by the way, when you create concrete jungles? The ghetto was not is not a natural farming entity. It was created. It is a social construction. Okay. Again, I grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois. East St. Louis, Illinois. My grandfathers get there. all right, turn of the century, okay, last century. They get there because they leave a state called Mississippi because of lynching. He gets to East St. Louis, Illinois, and there's a race riot. Why is there a race riot? Existential threat. What existential threat? White labor is going on strike at the stockyards. What did the stockyards do? Meat packing companies, they hired blacks to take their place. By the way, you want to guarantee that there's going to be a fight in a race riot? Replace workers with one group versus another. By the way, those two groups fought, killed each other, and an uneasy truce came into being as East St. Louis became white and black. Blacks living on one side, whites living on another. When blacks rose up in the 60s for civil rights, guess what happened with all of the companies that were in East St. Louis? They moved out. Okay, East St. Louis, when I grew up, there was jobs, there was merchants, there were industry, so forth and so on. After the 60s civil rights movement, same thing happened to Cleveland, same thing happened to Detroit, same thing happened to Chicago. What happened? The jobs left those areas to the suburbs, okay? And we created ghettos. Oh, those of you in Cincinnati, and I've got 334, I'm gonna be through in 6 minutes. Trust me, I will, okay? Those of you in Cincinnati, an existential threat hit Cincinnati. All right, what happened? You had a Black Wall Street in Cincinnati. Whites, poor, rose up, fought, riot. What happened to those residents? They were told to get the hell out of town before sundown, and we created a place called Lincoln Heights, okay, right outside of the city of Cincinnati, okay? Oh, help me out here. Lincoln Heights wasn't anything problematic, so forth and so on, and then you get GE decides to put a plant there. Now all of a sudden you got a tax base. What happens? Some individuals decide, suburbans, that we will carve out this district and it's no longer part of Lincoln Heights, to become part of Washington, whatever that is, okay? And you take that tax base, and now Lincoln Heights has no tax base, and guess what? It is one of the poorest areas in this country. Systemically, let me give you one other thing. So why does CRT matter? Okay, it matters because of one thing. It's challenging us to look at the systemic ways in which racism gets reinforced. Let me give you one more example. Here in the state of Ohio, by the way, I'm not a lawyer, but I love law, okay? All right, state of Ohio, on 4 separate occasions, the Ohio Supreme Court has ruled that the way we fund education is patently unconstitutional, okay? How do we fund education? We spend more money just at the state level in affluent suburban schools than we do in either urban schools that are predominantly Black or rural schools that are predominantly white, okay? All right, that's at the state level. Then you take the second way that we fund education. From the state, we got that bunch of money. Then you got the real estate taxes. All right, well, real estate, it does not take a Einstein to realize that real estate taxes in suburban communities are higher than the real estate taxes in urban or poor communities. And lastly, I got 4 minutes. I'm doing good. All right, lastly, let's talk about how the federal government created the suburbs and redlining. Let's talk about how HUD, okay, Housing and Urban Development, used monies in the 1950s and particularly 1960s to actually finance white flight, okay, while at the same time giving loans to whites to flee urban areas, but not giving those same loans to Blacks either in those areas or to flee those areas. Oh, by the way, that was known as redlining. Okay, by the way, subsidized by the federal government, state governments, and local governments, all right, in particular in terms of HUD. So what did we do? We created ghettos and what they call it, vanilla suburbs and chocolate ghettos. By the way, those are institutional problems that led to this cradle to prison pipeline. So essentially, what is critical race theory? It looks at how our histories have served to create opportunities for some at the expense of others, all right? And how do we deal with that? by current efforts to transform those systems. My last comment, and then I'll open it up for some specific questions. Martin Luther King became dangerous in this country, not when he was talking about Blacks, not when he was talking about even the war, but when he started talking about the Poor People's March on Washington. Now, all of a sudden, he's talking about poor Blacks and poor whites and Hispanics and Native Americans, which are the majority of this country. All right, he challenged the very institutional basis of power within this country, and he marked himself for death. Questions?
Dr. Coates, you mentioned something about diversity and inclusion training or programming, and how CRT is really addressing something different. Could you explain that a little more? Because a lot of us are involved in the area of diversity and inclusion, and we think we are trying to move the ball forward in terms of addressing discrimination and racism and whatnot. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
I mean, think about something in this country and in Europe dealing with former colonized people, us dealing with former slaves and Native Americans and Hispanics, and then also sexual groups, age discrimination, list of others. We spent a lot of money on what Martin Luther King called persuasion. We've been trying to persuade whites that Blacks and Natives and Indigenous and women are people. Okay. By the way, we just had a U.S. Congressperson that talked about African American voting and American voting. Okay. Here we are in 2022, and we're still distinguishing between Americans versus Blacks versus trans versus women, so forth and so on. Persuasion does not work. Okay. What does work? Okay. What works is changing institutional practices, laws, procedures. Okay. Let me give you one case in point. Harvard University and several other universities have discovered that the testing mechanisms that they were using do not work. In fact, they tend to discriminate against urban residents, poor residents, so forth and so on. Okay. They decided, particularly after COVID and because of COVID, that they were going to suspend using these test scores. By the way, many of these universities began suspending them long before that. Okay. And they found out that test scores like ACT and SAT does not determine who will be successful in school. All right. What determines you'll be successful in school, by the way, is your GPA. Okay. That's a much more determinant of how well you'll do in college. What do ACT and SAT do? They basically tell us what kind of community you come from. My kid, I had a little bit of money. He went to Summit Country Day. Okay. At Summit Country Day, private school, guess what? They had for their students ACT prep classes. They don't have ACT and prep classes in your public schools in the city of Cincinnati. Oh, and I'm talking to my son. So what did you learn in this class about history or science or math or what? I didn't learn a damn thing, Dad. What did you learn? He said, I learned how to take a test. And because he learned how to take a test, he scored 20 points higher on the SAT and ACT than he would have normally. That meant that he would have had access to scholarships, so forth and so on. But because his dad is here, he got in for free. That's another story. All right. But a diversity training and inclusion program does not change the institutional structure. Okay. All right. So you can get people, by the way, very sophisticated on taking bias training. Okay. By the way, any of you, I'm sure all of you have taken the Harvard implicit bias test. Guess what I know? After the second time, you're able to trick the test so that you're no longer, whatever you were before. All right. You have not become less biased. You just become more sophisticated in taking the test and you know how to score. Okay. That's the difference. Oh, one last thing. More police, we've had a couple of cases. Cincinnati is a great case in point. Cincinnati had 14 Black men shot by police. Okay, all right. All of the persuasion and so forth did not change that. Blacks rioted, and all of a sudden, the laws changed in the state of Ohio, where police can no longer say that they felt threatened and therefore kill someone. Guess what? After they no longer felt threatened, but after they no longer could use that as a defense, they stopped shooting unarmed Black men in the city of Cincinnati after Blacks rioted and the state changed the law, so forth and so on. Isn't that strange? Questions?
Dr. Coates, this is Zach here. So you've talked a lot about the systemic nature of the way racism and the way that CRT analyzes that system. But obviously, for a system to be in place, there are certain pillars, institutional pillars that hold it up. Can you talk a little bit about what those institutional pillars are? Maybe give a couple of examples of how racism is manifested in those pillars?
I'm a Vietnam veteran. And as a Vietnam veteran, I was in something called Army Security Agency. And in Vietnam, we part of our job was to track the enemy, the Viet Cong. Well, that's kind of hard to do in many of the areas that were called jungles. But they communicated with each other using Morse code and using radio signals. We discovered through a thing called triangulation that we could, if we get a signal from the north, from the south, and from the east, we measure it. We're able to look on a map and see where these three lines crisscross, and that will identify where the person sending the signal and receiving the signal would be. Okay, all right. Well, what is that? How does that work? Fixing an individual within society. We know that if your educational system is poor, that you're not going to get a good job, and you're more likely to be targeted by police. It's interesting that the very first laws to control both Blacks and women in this country controlled access to education. In fact, it was against the law to educate Blacks. It was against the law for women to receive education above a certain point. It's strange that one of the first institutions that came into being after the Civil War was instituted in the South by former slaves, and the first institution they set up were schools. Okay, and by the way, why did the Southern Confederates individuals, plantation owners, why were they fearful of education? They said that an educated Black was the most dangerous person in the South. They would plan insurrections. They would not be satisfied in their condition, so forth and so on. You want to keep someone where they are, keep them stupid, okay? Two, look at the differential in educational funding we just talked about in the state of Ohio, and that the same thing could go elsewhere, all right? So, by the way, because of poor education, individuals have poor job choices. Because they have poor job choices, they're more likely to find themselves targeted by police and living in poor neighborhoods without access to medical care, everything from COVID testing, so forth and so on, and the list goes on and on. Okay. Oh, by the way, living in such communities at the point of desperation, increased likelihood that you will not that you will do crime, but that you will be arrested for crimes. It's interesting that college students do not do any more drugs than students in or kids in urban areas, but we have a higher per person police presence in urban areas than we have in suburban and or rural areas, and we have a differential courts dealing with crime coming out of urban areas, for example, crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. Okay, so if you're poor and living in urban areas, guess what? You're more likely to be criminalized for your drug abuse. If you live in suburban areas, you're more likely to be medicalized. So, by the way, you're poor, you're living in urban communities. Oh, poor education, are more likely to be targeted by police. Differential crime. That's, by the way, 4 institutional structures. Or what happens if you get arrested, okay, for any of these crimes? That means that you can't vote. less likely to be able to get a decent job. You're not going to get college, so forth and so on. Okay. Wow. All right. Add to this, again, we talked about educational testing and such. Up until recently, most colleges and universities still are using HC and SAT, which we know discriminate. So we're spending less money on poor and Black education. We're spending more money on policing those communities. By the way, we don't have an effective job base. Okay, and look at places like Cincinnati, look at places like Lincoln Heights, look at places like East St. Louis. There is absolutely no job base. Why does someone go to college? Why do they go to school? Because of hopes of jobs that are available to them. Where are those jobs? Okay, those are these institutional pillars that work together in systemic ways. That's why fixing one does not fix the other, so forth and so on. That's why we must have a system-wide process to deal with these questions.
Dr. Coates, can you tell us why CRT has become so controversial at this time?
At this time, we're in this existential crisis right now. We've been in them before but the interesting is many times in the past, these existential crises have not been particularly created. So we have a depression, all right, that pits one group against the other. We have a war that pits one group against the other. Well, we're in a situation where we're actually are pitting groups against each other. Okay, we got political processes that are literally saying if you're brown, you are here illegally, challenging that. The one recent ad that I saw is by an individual from Latin America says, I am a legal immigrant. All these others are illegal immigrants that are only coming in this country to steal our jobs and to bring God only knows what drugs and whatever. Okay. By the way, we are racializing these individuals. We're marginalizing these individuals. Oh, take COVID, for example. COVID, we see the spike in hate crimes, particularly targeting who? Chinese people. Why? After this Chinese virus notion, the China virus, not, by the way, COVID, but the China virus and the presumption that China manipulated this virus and dumped it on unsuspecting world purposefully so. Oh, by the way, Jews are also being targeted. Why? Because they were going to create the drug that was going to get them, get us off from this. So let me see if I get this straight. Both Jews and Chinese work together to produce this thing so that they can put us down and also make money on it. Oh, we notice that there's an increase in hate crimes targeting in this country, both Chinese and, by the way, Jews. Oh, also, we're targeting brown people, immigrants. By the way, there's 4 groups that were targeted under the previous administration, and because of some notion that they were bringing in criminal elements and so forth and so on. By the way, all of this is fanning the flames of this racial existential threat, and that's what we're dealing with. Next question.
Thanks again, Professor Coates. What are some of the myths as you see them kind of going about CRT?
Congressperson Rufio made 4 central claims, and he's just quoting what others are quoting. One, that CRT is Marxist inspired, that it defines race structurally. By the way, it casts whites as oppressor and oppressed, so forth and so on. We've already dealt with these in terms of, guess what? And that it aims to destroy the family, okay? There's some interesting work that documents that, one, there are several critical race scholars and critical scholars, such as Max Weber, Foucault, and yes, Karl Marx, okay? but also the notion that critical race is trying to destroy Western values. I was in Kroger about 2.5 months ago. I live in Liberty Township, and I see this individual wearing this MAGA hat and Trump and so forth. You know, it's my neighbor, and I had some time, and they were drinking. They had this open bar or whatever at Kroger on the weekend. So I'm sitting down and said, "So explain to me this issue right now." He said, "What issue?" I said, "How Trump won the election." He said, "Oh, it was stolen." Okay. And I said, "What other issues you got?" He talked about CRT. And I said, "What's your problem with CRT?" He said, "Well, they are Marxists, and they are anti-religious and so forth." By the way, I pointed out my crucifix. I informed them that I wear this in class and out, that I'm a Vietnam veteran. I'm highly religious. And by the way, I believe in the market system, okay, free market system. I believe in capitalism. Lastly, I am a teacher of critical race and ethnic studies. He says, "You are the enemy." He started shouting, so forth and so on. I get back to campus, and about 2 days later, my dean is calling me in saying, I just been on the phone for 2 hours, this individual trying to convince them that you're not the son of Satan, and that you're not trying to destroy the world. By the way, I've gotten hate mail. I even got a death threat just past semester by somebody threatening me because I teach this area. Okay. By the way, I find it interesting that World War II, they had this thing called, they didn't have GPS. Okay. So how did pilots know when they were over the target, American pilots and English pilots flying over enemy territory? They knew when they started getting flak, people started shooting at them. Okay. And then they would drop their load. The fact that CRT is being attacked by some of the extreme elements, not only in this country, but also in France and England, is an indication that CRT must be over the target. Okay. What does that mean? All right, that these are intended to shut people up. Okay. I argue that women do not become the B word until they become assertive and they start talking. By the way, lynching, which blacks got lynched? It was not those that yes or no, sir. It was those that chose to get educated, that chose to speak properly, that chose to try to lift them up out of the barrel. CRT matters because individuals are trying to tell the full story of this country and to transform this country for us all. Okay. All right. Where the opposite side is, as this phenomenal painting shows, there's this attempt, 1776 project, to whitewash that history. We got this choice right now of whether you want our gang, that's where I began, or you want Sesame Street. You remember our gang? I couldn't find a photo, but you remember our gang? Those who were old enough, you had these 4 or 5 white kids and this one black kid who never said anything. When he did, it was broken English, so forth and so on. His hair was all over his head, never combed, so forth and so on, right? Okay. But his role was to be the comic relief for everybody else, to be silent, to be the spook, essentially, that sat amidst us. Okay. Imagine, and it was all black and white. Imagine that's 1776 story. Imagine now Sesame Street in live and living color, all of the multiple dimensions of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of age, of ability, so forth and so on, okay, that makes us who we are. We're strongest as a diverse nation, not as a racist one. That's why it matters. That's why it's an issue right now. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to open up questions to the audience.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm in a law school, so it's a little echoey.
Hi there.
I was wondering how you were speaking about your role as an educator in sort of this fight for, as critical race theory has become such a controversial subject. How can we as like lawyers and future lawyers support you and other educators at the primary level and everything as you I think, attempt to add nuance to this, like what has like literally become a black and white issue, unfortunately.
As pointed out by over a century ago, the US laws were created specifically to regulate and control by creating what the then Attorney General Katzenbach concluded. To us, the laws and regulations are protections and guides established for our benefit and for our use. But to the poor, they are hostile measures established as harassment at all costs to be avoided. Okay? What you can do as lawyers is to make sure that the law is equally available and accessible and applicable to all of us. Right now, justice is not blind. Okay? Justice, it would be nice if justice were indeed blind, but it is not blind. It does not operate in equitable ways. Okay? All right. All you have to do is look at the application of the law. Okay? In terms of drug sentencing, in terms of murder convictions. By the way, there's an interesting site I urge all of you to take a look at, and it looks at exonerations by race. Okay? And you find that that rape, for murder, and for drug charges, that Blacks are most likely to be convicted, and they're innocent, more likely to be innocent and convicted. Okay, and they're more likely to spend more time for doing the same crime than their white counterparts. Okay, all right, and once convicted, they're least likely to be able to get on with their life even after they've done their time, okay, than their white counterparts. Okay, again, we need to take this image and realize that justice is not blind, all right, nor do we want justice to be equally but equitably applied. What does that mean? Okay, it means that, by the way, recognizing I worked in city of Chicago when I was a young person in a gang research thing, and they discovered something, that if you were in urban and Black, you're more likely to be sent to juvenile detention and whatever. If you were white and suburban, you're more likely to be sent to these alternative to detention programs. Okay, well, guess what? Alternative to detention are much more beneficial to young people. All right, particularly if they give them some opportunities to learn from their ways. There was an interesting person back in the 1920s that said that I'd never seen a bad kid yet. And he created what is called Boys Town and Girls Town. And they took immigrant kids out of urban and these conflict areas into these nice rural areas where they could learn to be better people. Now, by the way, we are very afraid of our kids, and most of them we consider to be criminal and bad. Questions?
Questions from the audience?
Dr. Coates, Mike. Yeah, this is Mike Hogan. How did this CRT piece get so politicized? A recent article I read where it actually quoted the NEA union that used, critical race theory as something that should be happening in K through 12. Whereas I know, educators at the college level like yourself are saying critical race theory study, dialogue has no place in K through 12. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, one, it's like saying that astrophysicists should be taught in K through 12. Okay, it's not. Okay, why? Students need a certain background in physics and math and science before they can deal with the concepts and such necessary. Critical legal studies, by the way, is not taught in high school, the public school, so forth and so on. Okay, it's taught in advanced law school. Okay, all right. Critical race studies, which derives from critical legal studies, is even more complex, and so therefore the idea that it should be taught in preschool, so forth and so on, is more than problematical. But here's an interesting thing that how it can influence education. Okay, I just worked with a group of STEM scholars. Okay, we just did a $2.5 million grant. They called me a critical race scholar into this team of STEM educators. Why? Because they needed to understand this thing called systemic racism. NSF is trying to figure out why we're not getting enough Blacks and Browns and Native Americans into STEM. By the way, the American Bar Association is also concerned with how come we're not getting enough women and Blacks into the C-suite or graduating from law school, okay, and passing the bar. Okay, all right. We argued that, and they wanted me in on it, and I by the way wound up leaving the team. We just put in a $2.3 million grant. What am I arguing in this? And how to increase the number of diverse people in STEM. By the way, that's women, that's Native Americans, that's Blacks, and that's Hispanics. How? It is the way we teach can impact upon the number of students. Let me tell you, what do you mean the way we teach? If I ask you, give me the list of the classical musicians, great thinkers, great philosophers, great legal scholars, okay? Many of you would wind up with a list of all white males. So the great philosophers were Plato and Aristotle and Kierkegaard, okay? All right. The great musicians were Beethoven and Brahms, okay? I'm sitting there saying, what about B.B. King? Okay, B.B. King is a great classical musician, okay? What happens when in the classroom you don't see yourself reflected as legal scholars, as chemists, as physicists? In fact, even worse than that, you wind up seeing yourself as the problem, okay? What happens when you don't see yourself as being beautiful or as being good or as being honest, but you see yourself as the deviant case, okay? You see yourself as the problem child, okay? Or you don't see yourself at all until it is a problem, okay? Critical race can inform the way we teach. The fact that all kids don't learn in the same way, okay? All kids need to see themselves in the class material. Oh, let me hit you with one more thing. If Blacks only appear in history at the point of slavery, if Native Americans only appear in history at the point of European conquest, all right, give you a case in point. Imagine what would happen if in law, we were able to say there were 400 legal systems among the Native Americans, all right? What could we learn from those 400 legal systems, all right, in terms of the practice of law, okay? What would happen if we looked at Islamic law, okay, along with Judeo-Christian law, okay, along with other kind of religious bases for determining law? What would that do? Okay, would that would that help us to understand law in more interesting ways? Lastly, what happens in terms of the C-suite in corporate law or in judicial benches where we don't see that many persons of color, all right, or women, okay? How do we increase their numbers of Native Americans, of Hispanic, of Appalachians, okay? Would it be in our interest to have such individuals, okay? I think it would be, okay? All right, and this is what CRT is aiming to do and why it's important. Question.
Don't be shy, folks. You have an expert here. Go ahead, Amy Perlansky.
Sorry, I'm really bad at just jumping in. Professor, and I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this. So I have a friend in Detroit, well, outside of Detroit, who teaches in a charter school. And she said that her student body tripled this academic year. When I asked her why, she said one of the reasons is that the parents don't want their children exposed to critical race theory. And I'll just assume that the people on this call are like-minded to me and open-minded enough to consider different theories. So how do we bridge the gap that's going to happen between those of us who are going to be well-versed because of conversations with scholars like you versus the students who are not going to have exposure because their parents don't want them to have exposure because of whatever fears they have? How do we're going to have two, it feels like we're going to have two different sets of who knows what and two different sets of knowledge. How are we going to handle that going forward?
Right now, we're already in the midst of what that looks like. You have one group of people who get their information from one set of news. Okay, I mean, hell, look at COVID. You got individuals that believe that Clorox or that other medications are more efficacious in dealing with it. Okay, that won't wear a mask, won't get vaccinated, so forth and so on. And this is based upon the knowledge that is being presented to them. 1,000+ people showed up in DC, and 1/3 of Americans do not believe the science. Okay, and by the way, they are dying in alarmingly high levels. If you look at who is most likely to die, most likely to be hospitalized and go into ICU, it's those that are unvaccinated. And this is clearly an issue of information, all right, and what they believe is the truth. Okay. At the end of the day, I firmly believe that parents are responsible for determining the course of action that their students learn. Okay, that's what parents do. That's what they say. Okay, the reality is that they are dying, and ignorance is not only bliss, but it is also deadly. Okay, so what happens? Either your kids, and here's I believe in survival, and that I believe that we as humans have learned how to survive. Okay, that's why we're still here, and we're the dominant racial animal race in the world. Race, by the way, only makes reference to species. That's the only way it really, has a difference. Okay, what it means? Stupid does not survive. Okay, in any generation in any plant, it's not going to survive. Okay, so the question becomes, if you want to give your kids the best opportunities, not only for survival, but also to thrive, then these are the kinds of things that will take them forward. If not, then choose stupid. Okay, again, I'm a religious person. Okay, you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and you got this tree of life, and it says you got a choice between life or death. I suggest you choose life. Okay, that's literally what's in the scriptures. Okay, they were being advised, no, you need to go ahead and choose this other route, and you got kicked out of Garden of Eden. That's a whole nother set of stories. Okay, that's my religious point for today. We are in this point right now where people get to make some choices. You can choose science and progress, or you can choose ignorance, stupidity, and death. Okay, that, by the way, is what democracy is about. Okay, it's about people making choices. Okay, by the way, I think that they should be informed choices. Okay, and by the way, I have a great hope in young people. Okay, young people are on the internet. Okay, like you read about, you all are. Okay, and they are coming into contact with ideas in ways that my generation never thought about, good and bad. Okay, all right. Some are going to survive, some are not, and that's literally where we're at. Questions?
Go ahead, Brolin. It looks like you've got your hand up.
Oh, hi. So I have a question. So, like, how does CRT assist minorities within minorities? So, like, for example, I'm a Syrian, which is not the same thing as being Syrian.
Right.
Okay. And when I go, for example, and just to test the waters in an area, I like to attend NAACP meetings. I have the utmost of respect. They've helped my people quite tremendously. Many people don't even know about us. And I like to test the waters by asking the different heads of different departments within the NAACP as to what the NAACP is willing to do within that specific section, within that different city, towards my people who require, multiple different, assistance, and they don't know what we are, and they don't even know that the NAACP has assisted us in the past
Nope.
multiple times.
Nope.
And what confuses me and profounds me more and more every year that I've assisted a lot of Assyrian people coming to this country. I used to work as an intern for an immigration law firm, and they came, they come here hoping for a better life because they've been prosecuted, for religious persecution for nearly a millennia, and which it is what it is. So and I myself, born in Iran, have also seen this persecution.
Mhm.
The thing is that when we come to this country, we're not even recognized as we're not recognized as a culture, or as a peoples, really. So I'm wondering, how does CRT affect, or at least assist,
Mhm.
minorities within minorities? Because that's technically what we are. We are that by definition that.
Yeah. By the way, the same thing happens with not only Middle Eastern, and you got a whole range of Middle Eastern groups, but also 82 different countries in Africa, and I always mess. Okay, and within Ghana, you got like 92 different ethnic groups. Okay, all right. That's what happens when we use these balkanized terms of race. Okay, and don't recognize that you know what, I've got neighbors that are Ghanaian, okay, who are staunchly Republican, okay. All right, I mean, they are staunchly Republican, okay. They had Trump signs. They right next door to me. They had Trump signs, okay, on their yard, okay, and I've got Biden signs in my yard, okay, and what's interesting is that we're the best of friends, okay, but we're politically different. But it's interesting that his kids late at night have some of the same experiences as my kids, okay. Many Muslims flew under the radar in this country until 911, okay. And they have since 911 been racialized heatedly. All right. Now it's interesting that you have somebody like Malcolm X, okay, who claimed to be a Muslim, okay, until he goes to Mecca, and in Mecca he discovered groups within groups within groups, okay, and he realized that he had this this American notion of Islam, all right, that did not understand the many differences within the groups, okay. And what CRT helps us to understand is not only those realities exist, but then add these other things like race. I mean, but let me give you a case about race. So there are Africans who are white. There are Africans who are Asian. There are Africans who are Middle Eastern, and there are Africans who are labeled as Black. Okay. All right. Really? Okay. And by the way, they can do this within the same family. Okay. All right. Same thing happens in Bolivia, and happens in Brazil, happens in, okay. All right. This is what critical race theory helps us, or wants to help us to understand, okay, and wants to deconstruct this thing called race, okay, and recognize that, you know what, all people that come out of the Middle East don't believe, walk, act, do the same thing, okay. The Palestinians have a different set of issues than the Sandinistas, okay, or the Afghans, okay. To lump people into the same group is more than problematic, but that's what we do with race, okay. And then we want to treat and want people to act the same, all right. Then that's where we play these stereotypes. So why don't you act this way? Okay, it's interesting that by deconstructing these large pan-ethnic identities, that we actually start treating individuals for who they are as opposed to what they are. Okay, and by the way, that means looking at the history of Assyrians in this country. Okay, looking at the history of Afghans in this country, looking at the history of a whole bunch of other individuals in this country. All right, and recognizing that it's much like our kids. Okay, I got 3 or 4 kids. I got 3, not 3 or 4. I actually got 3. I know exactly how many I've got. I call my students as my kids. Okay, but guess what? They are all different. What happens if I treat them as if, you know what, you're all my kids, I'm going to treat you like, no, I can't do that. Okay, Kevin wants to be treated as Kevin, Chris wants to be treated as Chris, and I'm darn Renee would be upset if I treated her like one of the guys. Okay, all right, our very humanity dictates that we are treated as individuals, and that's where the term equity comes from, as opposed to equality. Okay, equity recognizes those differences. Okay, all right, and charges us to see the person in their totality, not just part of a ethnic or religious group, but also part of a gender group, and also part of a sexual group, and also part of an age group, and also part of a class group, and also part of national, international group, also part of a whole bunch of other things, also part of a class group, also a professional. All these things that make us these beautiful, unique creatures called humans. Okay, all right. And the whitewashing of history going to 1776 would want to reduce those differences. CRT would want to expand those, okay, and try to come to grips with what that diversity really looks like and what it means.
Thank you. Other
Thank you.
questions? Okay, I've got another one, Dr. Coates. So you mentioned something about Generation Z being the most diverse, the most intelligent. And I can remember having a conversation with my youngest son, who went to Walnut Hills, which is a city school here.
But a damn good one.
Cincinnati Public, good school. And he had some friends in the back, and I was asking him about, you know, how are gay people treated at school? And they're like anybody else, like, what's the big deal? You know, and then they go through and tell me about the diversity. Very different experience in my other sons who went to St. Xavier High School, which is a Catholic, well, you probably know, predominantly white Catholic, upper middle class school. And so I've always had the feeling that maybe, you know, generations after us will finally get it, that they'll be diverse enough and smart enough to move the needle to where we need to get. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
First of all, we cannot just have blind faith that they are going to just get it. Okay. I think that just your observations that, oh, I got 2 kids and they went to 2 different schools and they have slightly different outcomes based upon that. Okay. And recognizing that, then I think we can be more intentional about the conversations we have with each other, recognizing that the 2 kids had 2 different experiences. Okay. All right, so how do we deal with those different experiences? We have to help translate that for our kids, all right, and help them to realize, you know what, everything, here's the thing, we call it critical thinking at Miami University. On my syllabi, I have the following phrase. It reads something to the extent of, today, many people want you to believe what they say is the truth, okay? I want you to challenge that thing called the truth, and that starts with challenging me, your professor, okay? And the material that we use. If anything that I say or the material that we use, if you can come up with researched, Google Scholar, that demonstrates that this is bogus, it's false, so forth and so on, you'll get extra credit. Okay. I believe that we need to hold our teachers accountable. We need to hold our scholars accountable. We need to hold our politicians accountable. Okay. All right. We need to hold, and that we call that critical thinking. Okay. Look, democracy is this crazy thing. Okay. It requires us to be knowledgeable. Okay. The reason why the founding fathers put in not only checks and balances, but also pushed for public education was that they recognized that an educated public, not an indoctrinated one, but an educated public is the best assurance of a democracy. Okay. We want this thing called democracy to prevail. Then we as parents and as taxpayers need to insist that our schools do not indoctrinate our kids. Okay. All right. And what does that mean? All right. Here is science. Here is scholarship. Okay. All right. Not what I believe, not he's a college professor. No. Can he prove it? Okay. All right. Does this line up with the historical reality? And oh, by the way, there are multiple truths out there. It's not a single truth. So the truth of a slave owner is going to be different than the truth of a slave. It's going to be different from the truth of a female who is trafficked. It's going to be different from the traffickers, okay? What does that mean for us in terms of law or in terms of education, so forth and so on? It means that the more angles that we're able to bring to bear, the more of these perspectives that we're able to bring to bear, not this mythical monolithic, well, this is what blacks think, and this is what whites think, and this is what women think. By the way, that has gotten more men in trouble than I know of, that women think this, okay? You want to please women, then do this, okay? That will get you in more serious trouble than I know of, okay? Why? Because all women are different, okay? All men are different. All of our children are different. Like the two children we started with, they are radically different, okay? And the future demands that we recognize those differences. And by the way, we want to bring as many of these angles into the classroom, be it legal studies, be it sociology, be it math, so forth and so on, into this setting so that our students become, and hear this, liberally educated, well-rounded individuals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Claire Gaglione, question?
Yes, thank you. If I may ask another question. So I think that, Professor, your point about bringing in so many different perspectives and angles is so true. I've been kind of reading and hearing different things about the role of social media sites like YouTube and even TikTok and Instagram, and how they can both provide a lot of really wonderful platforms for creators to give those different perspectives, but also can be very dangerous in radicalizing individuals through kind of the use of the algorithm, where it kind of funnels you into certain ideological pathways.
Yes.
Can you kind of talk about your perspective on that as someone who's an expert?
Yes. By the way, I define myself as a progressive liberal Democrat. Okay. Guess what? I regularly watch Fox News. Okay. I regularly watch it. Okay. I believe that if we limit ourselves to one source of news, regardless of its ideological bent, one religious persuasion, regardless of how vested in God's word we think it is. Okay, again, I'm a Christian, and I remember Jesus said, you need to know God for yourself. Okay, well, I believe that knowledge and information is something that we need to encourage people to seek out for themselves. And by the way, weigh different perspectives and understand something very real. Okay, that we all are biased. Let me repeat that. Every last one of us is biased. I am not God. Whoever she is, okay, all right, she's not me, okay? That means that if you listen to me versus someone else, you're going to get 3 different perspectives, okay? All right, you all are in the law, are going to be in the law. If you ask 3 people what happened, they're going to give you 3 different stories, okay? They all 3 saw the same thing, but they saw it from a different perspective. Let me give you one more case in point. One for a 14, 15-year-old kid who happened to have their camera running when George Floyd was killed by the police officer. The police would still be saying, well, look, he resisted arrest and he died by accident. All right, because we got the vantage point of another person who, by the way, recorded this. All right, we get a different version of the truth. Okay, what happens? I think going forward, we're in this information. You've heard it, explosion. Okay, all right, and we are the most stimulated in terms of all of these images and bits and so forth and so on. This is where critical thinking comes into play. And as parents, the biggest thing we can do is to encourage our kids to challenge the truth, okay, to question the truth, okay, all right. Every totalitarian government, from Caesar through Hitler to you name it, okay, they survived by burning books, shutting down schools, and telling people, here is what you need to know, okay, all right. So our only salvation is to question that, to challenge that, to critique that. Questions? I see a hand up with Christopher, been up for a while, but questions?
Hi, thank
We
you.
got plenty of time.
We've talked about a lot about religion here, and that's where I'm coming from. I'm preface my comments by saying I'm not a deeply religious person,
Okay.
at least not anymore, but I grew up that way. If you called my family fanatics, they'd probably say thank you. And where this has really hurt me the most, where I've struggled the most, is you try to have those conversations about critical thinking, and you try to drop some knowledge and try to point out how their dogma is inconsistent with the words of Jesus Christ, and you're discounted as fancy or indoctrinated.
Yeah.
And
Well,
how these folks think that they have a divine commitment and their immortal soul depends on continuing to be wrong-headed.
yeah,
How do you compete with that?
you don't. I've been kicked out of more churches than you know about. Okay, okay, and I recognize that this is my truth. It might not be your truth. Does this work for you? Cool. Okay. My job is not to convince you that my truth is the truth. Okay. All right. My job is to say, look, this is what I believe. This is what I believe. It might not be what you believe. Okay. But this is how I'm going to operate my life. Okay. And by the way, I'm not going to judge you, but you will probably judge me. That's cool. Okay. All right. I understand that within this domain, right? You call it a church or whatever. All right. Then whatever you say rules. Okay. That's cool. I recognize that's that institutional structure that you control. Good. I don't have to go there. Okay. All right. But and similarly in my classroom, by the way, I wear this outside of class. In class, this goes inside my shirt. Okay, because I don't want to even subtly encourage a particular religious belief. If students ask me, I'll tell them this is my belief, but guess what? I got great friends that are Muslims. My dad was an atheist. Okay, my mom was highly religious. Okay, both my grandfathers were preachers. Okay, but my dad will tell you in a minute, God did not exist. Okay, and don't bring that shit up in this house. I got you, Dad. Okay. All right. We had major arguments, but at the end of the day, It was his house, his rules. Okay. And so I wound up getting up out of there. Okay. All right. I'm not into proselytizing people. That's not my job. I'm not a preacher. Okay. All right. I'm a teacher. Okay. That means if you ask me what I believe, I'm going to tell you this. You ask me what are the facts, I'm going to tell you this. And those are not always the same thing. But I will tell you that your beliefs can cause certain facts to come into being. A situation is perceived as real in its outcomes. If you perceive something is real, let me give you one more case in point, then I'll move to another question. I used to honestly believe that Friday the 13th bad luck was going to happen. I'll be damned. Every time Friday the 13th hit, shit fell on me, like you read about. I said, shit, I can do that. Okay. All right. It hit me. Okay. And then one day I woke up and I realized that shit happens every day, not just Friday the 13th. But if I look for it on Friday the 13th, I would find it. I start looking for Friday the 12th. Guess what? I found it. Okay. What that demonstrated to me is you can find whatever truth you are looking for. Okay. All right. It's out there. All right. And you can live your life by that truth. All right. Is that a universal truth that joins us all? I doubt it very seriously. But if it works for you, go for it. This is the one that works for me. Okay. And if you ask me how I got here out of East St. Louis, out of Vietnam, through drugs, through suicide, through a whole bunch of other things, I'm going to tell you, but for the grace of God, go I. Okay. But there are a whole bunch of people that didn't survive and they believe the same thing. Why me? I don't know. Okay. And I think that's that we have to get. Here's the facts. Okay. This, and this. 1 and 1 does not always equal 2. All right. It does not always equal, but let me tell you why. That assumes that both ones are equal, and ones don't equal 1 except for in the abstract. Okay. Outside of that, 1 and 1 never equals 2. That's the truth.
Oh, there you have it. We are a little beyond 4:30. Dr. Coates, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your insight, your wisdom, and your experience with our group. You have given us much to think about and a great foundation for moving forward with this program. So if you would all join me in thanking Dr. Coates, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you for your participation today, folks. Be on the lookout for our next program. And I wish you the best. And thank you again, Dr. Coates.
Thanks so much, Dr. Coates.
And thank you very much for allowing me to share my insanity with you. Be blessed.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. LaDonna, can you hang on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. I just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Coates, Rodney. This is Lisa. Oh, I was just going to introduce you to Lisa McPherson, the director of the Bar Association.